The air in the Carpathian passes always carried the scent of wet pine and ancient stone. But when you reached the valley floor, where the village of Satomagur huddled against the rising damp, you noticed the cold was different. It was a sterile, deep cold that seemed to deaden sound rather than echo it.
You were seekers of lost histories, three academics armed with skepticism and modern instruments, convinced that the superstitions of isolated communities were merely distorted reflections of real, quantifiable events: a plague, a famine, a forgotten political atrocity. You had traveled thousands of kilometers because local legends hinted at a forgotten pagan site hidden within a patch of forest the villagers called Pădurea Strigoi, the ghost thicket. You spent the better part of the afternoon questioning the elders. You learned that the thicket was not extensive, perhaps only a kilometer in circumference, and that the path leading to it was rarely used, overgrown with thorns and brittle briars. The villagers were forthcoming, willing to speak about the daylight hours, detailing the rough directions and the specific curve of the stream that marked the boundary. But when the leader of your expedition, Elias, inquired about the possibility of setting up camp in the vicinity for an extended study, the atmosphere in the smoky tavern shifted violently. An old woman, whose face was a map of hard living, suddenly insisted you must understand the rules. She said that the forest was asleep during the day, harmless, but that once the sun dipped below the western ridge, the thicket woke up, and nothing that entered it after sundown ever left unchanged. Another man, younger but just as terrified, warned that even the shadows cast by the thicket after 3 o'clock in the afternoon were poisonous to the soul. He explained that their fear was not of the spirits of the dead, but of the things that kept the dead. Elias, noting the theatrical intensity of their fear, informed them that their mission was scientific, and that strange electromagnetic readings had already confirmed some sort of localized, unusual energy signature centered precisely where they described the thicket to be. He politely asserted that dismissing genuine phenomena based on fear was intellectually dishonest. He told them that you would be staying. You rented a small, stout cart and followed the directions given, crossing the narrow stream just as the late autumn sun began its inevitable slide toward the horizon. The woods leading up to the thicket were standard Carpathian forest, dense, whispering, but breathable. Then, abruptly, the air changed. The boundary of Pădurea Strigoi was marked not by a fence or a path, but by a chilling, absolute silence. You noticed that the birdsong, which had been constant, vanished entirely. The wind rustled the leaves outside the thicket's perimeter, but within it, the air was utterly still, as if the very sound waves hesitated to enter. The soil underfoot became oddly springy, carpeted by a thick, sickly pale moss that grew nowhere else in the surrounding region. You pressed on, driven by the thrill of discovery and the ticking clock of the setting sun. Clara, the expedition's cartographer, remarked to Elias that the trees seemed to grow closer together here, obscuring the sky even at midday, suggesting that the light had always struggled to penetrate this specific space. She pointed out that the trunks were thicker, older, and strangely gnarled, twisted into supplicating shapes, like silent, wooden figures kneeling in pain. It took only 30 minutes of heavy walking to locate the structure the villagers had mentioned. It was a hermit's hut, or perhaps a shepherd's temporary shelter, built of rough-hewn logs and mud, half sunk into the damp earth. It had clearly been abandoned for decades, perhaps a century. The roof had partially caved in, choked by the pale moss, and the wooden door hung loose on a single rusty hinge. Marius, the third member of your group, a specialist in folklore who usually reveled in the atmosphere of discovery, found himself unable to speak for several moments. He later confessed that he had felt an intense, overwhelming urge to turn around and run, the feeling not rooted in logic, but in a primitive, animalistic dread. You entered the hut. The interior was small, dark, and overwhelmingly permeated by the odor of mildew and something else, something metallic and bitterly cold, like static electricity mixed with dried blood. You quickly established that the hut contained no artifacts, no religious implements, and no signs of mundane life. It was just an empty husk. But the walls. You had come prepared to document protective symbols, wards against the devil, rough carvings of the cross or the Mother of God, perhaps even ancient Slavic pagan runes meant to keep nature's wrath at bay. Instead, the wood was covered, from floor level up to the remnants of the ceiling, in precise, deeply gouged carvings that detailed only profound, desperate despair. These were not casual graffiti. They were methodical inscriptions, clearly executed over a long period by many different hands. Elias began transcribing the text, his voice low and mechanical as he translated the archaic Romanian and local dialects. He read aloud that the first series of carvings were specific instructions. One phrase repeated endlessly, "Don't look back." Another section demanded severe self-control, advising the inhabitant to never breathe the air of the west window after the stars appear. You found the more philosophical, terrifying inscriptions next. One lengthy, elegant script declared that the darkness here was not the absence of light, but a physical hunger that ate the edges of identity. The author of that message pleaded that if anyone found the hut, they should burn it to the ground, and that they must not, under any circumstances, allow the dawn to catch them inside. Then came the core of the mystery, the lines that haunted you most deeply. These were not prayers for salvation, nor pleas for divine intervention. They were demands for oblivion. Marius pointed to a section where the wood was scored so deeply that the knife must have broken. The message there, translated by Elias, was a raw entreaty: "Take me swiftly, Lord. I beg only for speed. Let the breaking be quick." Another, scratched nearby, was simpler and more chilling: "Death is mercy. End this life before it ends the self." Clara noted that the carvings always referenced a state of being worse than death, a condition of persistent, agonizing consciousness. You worked quickly, snapping photographs and recording dimensions, but the oppressive silence of the thicket began to press in on your nerves. Despite the scientific rigor of your mission, the psychological weight of the place was immense. You found yourselves whispering, even though there was no one else around to hear. Elias declared that this was a monumental discovery, a testament to the psychological breakdown of isolated communities, perhaps the result of a mass psychosis triggered by extreme deprivation. He insisted that the carvings, while chilling, were merely sociological data points. He stated firmly that you would remain in the thicket until morning, to gauge the atmospheric changes during the hours of darkness. Marius strongly disagreed, stating that the consistency of the fear across generations, combined with the extreme specificity of the carved warnings, suggested a persistent, non-psychological threat. He pleaded that they should trust the instinct that was screaming at them to leave. You looked at your watch. It was 4:45 in the afternoon. In the valley, the last rays of the sun were already reaching the height of the main ridge. Elias reminded Marius that leaving now meant abandoning the core purpose of their trip, and that they would never explain to the Foundation why they fled a deserted shack due to old wives' tales. He suggested they secure the entrance and wait out the night, proving the locals wrong. The moment the sun disappeared entirely, the temperature dropped by what felt like 20 degrees in a single minute. It wasn't the slow crawl of evening cold, it was the sudden, physical withdrawal of all heat energy. You lit the small oil lamp you had brought, casting dancing, erratic shadows on the walls covered with their silent, agonized screaming. You heard the locals' words echo in your mind: "The shadows are poisonous." Clara consulted the electromagnetic scanner. She reported, her voice thin with anxiety, that the ambient energy readings, which had been merely anomalous outside the hut, were now peaking wildly, flickering across the maximum detection threshold. She said it was not the steady pulse of a geological phenomenon, but something erratic, something that seemed to surge and recede like a breath. Elias, attempting to maintain control, suggested that the drop in temperature, and the electrical spikes were likely related to a subterranean mineral bed interacting with the cooling air. He reiterated that you were safe within the thick log walls. But then the silence began to break. It did not break with a roar or a howl. It broke with a sound that was less than sound, a quality of noise that felt like a vibration behind the eyes. It was a low, humming frequency that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly within the bone. Marius immediately covered his head, saying that the noise felt like pressure, like his skull was being gently shaped by an unbearable force. He asked, though he knew the answer, if the others could hear it too. The hum intensified. It carried no discernible melody or rhythm, yet it conveyed intense suffering, not human suffering, but something vast, ancient, and fundamentally alien. The air grew heavy, thick, making it difficult to draw a full breath. Elias swallowed hard, admitting that he could not locate the source of the noise, and that the electrical fluctuations were now so extreme they were interfering with the compass and the internal clock. He suggested that perhaps they should rethink their position. You looked at the carvings again, the deep, frantic scores of the knife. Let the breaking be quick. You understood then that the walls were not carved with protective symbols because nothing in the human arsenal could repel what came here. The pleas were not directed at heaven, but at the thing itself, a negotiation for a merciful end. Suddenly, Clara noticed the change in the light. The oil lamp, though steady, seemed to be casting shadows that were too dark, too solid. The shadows did not obey the physics of the small flame. Instead of thinning out at the edges, they coalesced, like pools of ink spilled on the floor, gradually creeping up the legs of your folding stools. She called out to the others that the shadows were moving independently of the light source, and that they seemed to be heading toward the center of the room. She wondered if this was the essence of the warning, the reason the villagers left the entire area dark after dusk. Marius gripped his chest, reporting that the humming sound now felt like it was inside him, vibrating his internal organs. He whimpered that the pressure was causing a terrible dizziness, and he asked Elias if they were going to die here. Elias, dropping his notebook, moved to the single, small, boarded-up window. He stated that they had to see what was outside, that empirical observation was their only defense against panic. He ripped away the rotten planks. The sight, though quickly glimpsed, erased the last vestiges of his scientific detachment. He immediately slammed the wood back into place, breathing harshly, and reported, in a voice utterly devoid of color, that there was nothing to see, only forest, but that the quality of the surrounding darkness was wrong. He described it as a negative space, heavy and absolute, and insisted that the air outside looked wet, like heavy black vapor clinging to the ancient trees. He said they needed to leave now, abandoning all equipment, reasoning that whatever was surrounding the hut was slow, perhaps, or bound by the walls, and that a sudden, panic sprint might still save them. He quickly grabbed the medical kit, telling Clara and Marius that they would follow the magnetic north bearing, ignoring the path, heading straight down the valley. He explained that they must move silently and quickly, and under no circumstances stop to look back. You extinguished the lamp. The cessation of light was immediate and absolute. The darkness inside the hut was marginally lighter somehow than the oppressive blackness pressed against the window. The humming noise intensified, now punctuated by a subtle, rhythmic grinding sound, as if immense unseen teeth were closing and separating nearby. You heard Elias fumble with the bolt on the decaying door. He told you to stay close, and that whatever happened, you must run. The door scraped open, releasing the pent-up tension of the thicket into the small space. A rush of bitterly cold wind, bearing the stench of turned earth and ozone, blew into the hut, but the rush was followed immediately by the sense of something vast moving just beyond the threshold, something immensely heavy and slow. Elias stepped out first. There was no sound of his feet hitting the ground, only a short, sharp gasp, abruptly cut off. You heard the sound of wood scraping against wood. The grinding returned, louder, closer, and with a sickening, wet undertone. Clara screamed, but the sound was thin and choked, instantly absorbed by the heavy air. She turned to Marius, urging him to run, telling him that she could feel the cold touching her skin, deep and penetrating, moving past her clothes. Marius, paralyzed by the humming, sank to his knees, his hands weakly pulling at the desperate carved pleas on the wall. He whispered that the fear was too much, that the pressure was building, and that maybe the authors of the inscriptions were right. He wondered if swift death was the only salvation. Then, through the vibrating air, you heard the faint, metallic click of a camera shutter. Clara, the dedicated recorder, taking a final, desperate picture of the doorway before she turned and bolted into the unseen forest. Marius remained on the floor of the hut, alone in the dark, the spectral light of the carvings his only witness. He waited for the cold, vast presence that had taken Elias to approach him. He whispered an incoherent prayer, not for life, but for the mercy of speed, hoping that the quick death promised in the desperate carvings was, indeed, reliable.
You do not know what happened to Marius, or if Clara ever found the path out of the thicket, or if the single photograph she took ever survived the darkness that seemed to consume everything. What you know is that the villagers of Satomagura, decades later, still refuse to speak of the thicket after the sun sets. They do not talk about the scholars who came and never left. They only speak, in hushed, fearful tones, about the sound of the deep, unending silence that always blankets Pădurea Strigoi, even when the wind screams through the rest of the valley. And they say that sometimes, on the darkest nights, the wind carries a sound that is not wind at all, a low, rhythmic, grinding scrape, like stone moving against bone, coming from the depths of the forest where death is only the beginning of the plea.